Welcome to a group who is going to be talking about or making the case today for Amendment 1, which is one of 3 constitutional amendments on this November's ballot. If you all would like to make any kind of an opening statement before we start with questions, that's fine, or else we can go straight into questions.
We'll make an opening statement.
Okay.
So definitely I think I want to say a few words, and then Allison,
Sure.
and then General McCollum. So,
Okay.
So Amendment 1, the Water and Land Conservation Amendment, will protect Florida's drinking water sources, protect the water quality of our rivers and our springs and our lakes and our coastal waters, protect our natural areas and wildlife habitat for future generations of Floridians, all without increasing taxes. When you think about the vision that past leaders in Florida had in terms of conservation, when you think about places like the Wekiva State Park or Rock Springs Run, or even parks right here in the heart of Orlando like Lake Eola, that previous leaders of the state of Florida had the vision and foresight to set those lands aside to protect the water quality and protect the natural areas and protect the springs so that you and I can enjoy them today. What Amendment 1 does, and what a yes vote on Amendment 1 will do, is make sure that future generations of Floridians, our children and our grandchildren, can enjoy clean water, crystal clear springs, beautiful natural areas, outdoor recreation opportunities, the same way we do today. And Amendment 1 does this all without increasing taxes. It's a very simple idea. It sets aside 1/3 of the state's documentary stamp tax. It's a real estate transfer tax. This is an existing funding source. It's been the source of funding for water and land conservation for almost 2 decades. The funds have recently, unfortunately, been diverted. What Amendment 1 does is restore them, make sure they'll be there for the next 20 years to protect Florida's water resources and its natural areas and its wildlife habitat, and that the legislature can't divert the funds. Most importantly, I think for your readers, Paul, Amendment 1 is not a tax increase. It will not increase taxes now or in the future. It simply designates an existing funding source that's tied to growth and development. So as Florida grows and develops, we should also be conserving some land and make sure those funds will be there for the future. So I'll turn it over to Allison.
My name's Allison Defoor, and my family's been in Florida to my grandchildren for 9 generations since the 1820s. I'm come from Key West, where we've done a lot of land conservation and environmental work over the years, and have done a pretty good job of combining the environment and the economy in ways that I think reflect where Florida is. There's no place that I know of in the Union, maybe Hawaii and Alaska, where the environment is tightly tied to the economy as it is in Florida. My background included being on the board of Associated Industries and Tax Watch and Florida Chamber Foundation on the business side, but also on 1,000 Friends and Florida Audubon and conservation organizations on the other side. And that reflects the sort of balance that came out of the P's in our work down there, where I was sheriff and a judge. It's part of the cleanup. I got involved in this with a cautious eye because I am a bit of a constitutional scholar in the past and am reluctant on the issue of changing the Constitution. I think this thing is well thought out. It's really the poster child of how you would use this amendment process in Florida. It's limited in duration. It's targeted both in the broad sense of policy, but not micromanaging. And it's by percentage, so if the economy goes up, it goes up. If the economy goes down, it goes down. And it's in response to inaction by the existing political structure. The attempts, we have a long legacy of this kind of conservation in Florida going back really to the creation of this documentary tax in the 60s through Governor Martinez, good Republican. I was vice chairman of the Republican Party of Florida at one point in my career, so I am pretty unabashed about claiming the Republican credentials here, through Governor Bush and Florida Forever, and then it stopped during the economic downturn, and then it just never started back up. So unavailing of the normal process, the citizens elected this petition process, and we got 1 million signatures to do it, and now we're on the ballot with a pretty high threshold, 60%. So it's going to take some real effort to get it done. At the end of the day, the reason I was willing to do it, after I believed that it was a well-crafted constitutional amendment, is I realized that we're at the end game. In 20 years, Florida's going to have 26, 27 million people. We're going to have this population of Texas in the footprint of North Carolina. And essentially, that which gets protected is going to get protected, and that which doesn't get protected is going to be gone. And we've been here 9 generations now and are going nowhere. So that became important to me, and I was willing to come fight, even though most of my life now, frankly, is about prison reform and prison ministries. But I came off the rocker for this one because it's kind of the end game, frankly. And it's not just important in a tree-hugging sense, but it's important for the economy. If we run out of water, Florida's done. And a fellow from the Tradewinds resort over in St. Pete Beach summed up the economic driver from the tourism side. The hotel and motel people have endorsed us, and he said this is protecting Florida's brand, which I think kind of sums it up. If you look at even the interior resorts like Disney and SeaWorld recreate the natural environment of Florida for their amenities. So, I mean, this really is what Florida's economy is about, and we need to protect it for both environmental reasons and for economic ones. So that's it for me.
I'm Bill McCollum, as you know, Paul. I'm former congressman from this area, Central Florida, and Attorney General of our state. When I was Attorney General, I served on 12 boards and commissions we call the Florida Cabinet loosely, where the governor, the attorney general, the chief financial officer, and the commissioner of agriculture all comprise the board of directors, if you will, of these agencies. And one of those agencies oversaw, and to this day oversees, the acquisition of land for conservation or the disposal of state lands. And that's where Florida Forever funding was utilized or not utilized when we didn't have it. So up close and personal, I saw what we can do and what we should do, how well it is managed, the people who are there who are working the programs with respect to the state lands. And the need for the continued acquisition is very, very important, just of land alone. There is nothing in this amendment that would require somebody to give up their land. This is not a condemnation process. This is we acquire land under Florida Forever. If somebody wants to voluntarily sell it to the state, although there are priority lands on the list that have been out there a while for different reasons that these two fellows have described. And then there are conservation easements, which some folks in agriculture and otherwise would like to keep and farm and ranch their lands, and they can do that, but they give up the right to develop it. And they still keep the land and still maintain it, live on it, do whatever with it. The other part that I'm very focused on in this was that I have been attuned to water for a long time in the state. And while Allison described the importance of having water, which of course is fundamental, what we also have a problem with, huge problem with, is algae and pollutants in our water, and we need to clean them up. And we have the technology in this state, we have the businesses to do that, and we don't have the funding. This amendment is dedicated to both causes. You can buy the land, and you can clean up the water, or you can buy conservation easements to protect where you need to do it. But water restoration is very, very important. Removing algae, cleaning up the springs out here at Wekiva, the St. Johns River, Lake Apopka, Lake Jessup, and many others, and of course the Everglades. So this is a dedicated source of funding and something very important, in my opinion, to make sure the legislature doesn't, in its qualms as it does occasionally, take away at least the base funding. We may need more money than this, and that'd be their decision, but this would be a very basic, dedicated source that will be there for the next 20 years. That's why this amendment's so important, in my opinion.
And just to close, Paul, Amendment 1, the Water and Land Conservation Amendment on the ballot this fall, is a common sense, no new taxes solution to Florida's water quality and land conservation problems. It's a very simple proposal. It dedicates a third of an existing real estate transfer tax to protect our state's water resources and conserve natural areas and wildlife habitat. It's not a new tax, and we would urge the Sentinel's endorsement. The final thing I'd like to add is there were a few folks who could not be with us here today, leaders in the Central Florida community who, like General McCollum, have endorsed Amendment 1. That includes Orlando Mayor Buddy Dyer, who has endorsed Amendment 1. Former Republican Mayor and Secretary of State of the state of Florida, Glenda Hood, has endorsed Amendment 1. And Senator Geraldine Thompson, sitting senator in the Florida Senate, also a strong supporter of Amendment 1, representing the Central Florida area. So we have a list of projects that could be funded, information about our endorsers, some of our other press clips that we'll leave here with you today, but happy to answer any questions.
Great. First question is, shouldn't decisions on the budget, even for worthy causes, as a matter of principle, be left to state lawmakers?
Well, I'll answer that in part, Paul. Normally, yes, but be truthful, the fund needs to be there for this purpose. And this is a basic amount. It's roughly what's been there in the past, and in times the legislature decides we want to spend money somewhere else or whatever. In this case, there's nothing, in my opinion, in the state that is a higher priority than water and conservation at this point in time. We as citizens sometimes don't recognize it. We don't go out and look around. But as Allison Defoor a minute ago, this is the heart of Florida. This is what makes Florida, Florida. So 1/3 of the documentary stamp revenues when you sell a house or a piece of property generally would simply be dedicated to this purpose. This doesn't decide how it's going to be spent, other than in these broad areas of water, conservation, land acquisition, conservation easements. So as Will said, there's no tax increase here. It's just saying, as you correctly analyzed, legislature, you got lots of other, maybe you need to put more money in. I think that probably you do, but the very limited amount, the very base that we're going to assure in the future for planning purposes and so forth, that we can have it. I'm going to add one last thing to this. I know my answer is a little bit long here, but on the water side of it, I see project after project that the water management districts are not proceeding with because there's no money being provided or very limited. Or let's look at how long those projects are when they do them. I saw earlier this year, and I'm very pleased they've done some of this, they got some long-range planning and they put however much money in. It's a drop in the bucket, Paul. It isn't going to clean up these bodies of water. You've got to have more resources to do that. If you're going to clean up Wekiva Springs, you're going to clean up Lake Jessup. We've got a Lake Apopka. I'm just talking about here in our home area. It's not going to work that way. So this forces that issue. And I frankly think the politics of Tallahassee will always have somebody else who has another priority, some special interest.
The wisdom of the American governance experiment is that it's a system of checks and balances. Sometimes it is necessary for the people to lead. In this case, this mechanism of leadership is in our Constitution. We didn't just make this up. It's there for a reason, and it creates an opportunity for the people to lead when the political establishment is not responding in a given area. In this particular case, the mechanism that they're using is finite in duration and reasonable in its fiscal impact, and does not interfere with any of the existing structures of governance, which is a very delicate balance of the legislative oversight on expenditures, the administrative and executive oversight, and even independent agencies such as the Fish and Wildlife. If you look at the way the Art Commission is constructed, none of that gets undone by this. So it's not. This is the people leading. It's not revolutionary, but it is the people leading, and
it's not getting done. The bottom line is, I served. I've been out of office 3 years. I served 4 years. So let's just add those 7 years since I first went into office, and the legislatures haven't done it, and the leadership's not been there to do more than a paltry sum compared to what's needed. It's the fact.
Is there any precedent, Allison, for any other budgetary decisions being set in the Constitution?
Oh, sure. Yeah, Preservation 2000 was in the Constitution. Florida Forever was, I believe.
Yeah, but in other revenue areas, Paul, there are similar constitutional directives to the legislature in education, in transportation, and in tobacco education. Those are the other three fiscal measures that are already in the state constitution. So there are precedent, and those are the precedents.
Yeah, okay. The amendment does not call for a tax increase, as you've made clear. But documentary stamp tax revenues, the fact that they haven't been dedicating necessarily in recent years doc stamp tax revenues to wildlife conservation means that they are available for other purposes, including transportation and affordable housing. So isn't this a zero-sum game for those other options or those other areas they could be investing in, including the two that I mentioned? Won't this come out of the hide of transportation or affordable housing, for example?
No, Amendment 1, yes vote on Amendment 1 will not have an adverse impact on funding other important state needs. The documentary stamp tax was used for conservation long before it was used for transportation or affordable housing in 1967-68 when the legislature dedicated this revenue source to conservation because of the direct tie between growth and development and the need to conserve lands. We, as a Citizens Initiative, had to undergo a very rigorous financial analysis by the state's Financial Impact Estimating Conference, the state's impartial budget writers. Their conclusion was that this does not have an adverse impact on other funding sources. In fact, the documentary stamp tax revenues are projected to grow. So as that pie increases and funding for conservation increases under Amendment 1, funding for other things funded by the doc stamp will also increase. And finally, if you look back even a few years back to 2006, 2007, at that point, north of 50% of the doc stamps were allocated for conservation. So 33% is actually stepping back a little bit in what we thought was a very reasonable proposal to fund a fundamental need, water and land conservation in this state.
Yeah, it's a little bit like, because we've rated your trust fund once, we can, should be entitled to keep doing it. So I'm a little reluctant to go there. But just in macroeconomic terms, not only is it not a zero-sum game, it's different than that, both going up and going down. Central Park, by specific example, has created the highest real estate values in the world on its periphery by its preservation and dedication. Okay, that was not a zero-sum game. In Florida, it could work the other way just as well. The more we pollute the state, the more we degrade our brand, in effect, the less competitive we will be. We, in fact, can put this thing in reverse, and in some ways may have, frankly. This is all we've got in Florida, is our environment. This is our cash cow, and if we're going to compete, we need to take care of, you don't stake the milk cow. That's simple cracker wisdom, and that's what we're talking about here. So no, it is not a zero-sum game, up or down.
If Florida is committed to earmarking doc stamp money for the environment and we suffer another serious recession that leads to a big downfall in state revenues, shouldn't other basics like public schools be a higher priority than environmental purchases or programs?
Paul, this is, if you look at Amendment 1 in the spectrum, in the context of the entire state budget, we're talking about 1% out of a $75 billion state budget. Surely we can spend at least that much on water and land conservation in Florida. As Allison said, Amendment 1 was designed on a percentage basis. So if, God forbid, our economy in Florida should again decline like it did during the economic recession, funding under Amendment 1 would decline too. So we're willing to take our hits if there is another economic crisis in this state, and we think we've designed the amendment in such a way that it's responsive to that.
Well, let me give you some alternative economic crises. We don't have enough water in Florida, or the water we've got is polluted, and the tourists decide they'd rather go to the Caribbean than come deal with our polluted waters. If you talk to the folks down around the Indian River Lagoon about last year, they call it the lost season.
Lost summer.
Because they couldn't sell any houses and they didn't get any tourists coming.
Because the water in the St. Lucie River was so polluted, the fish were dying, the manatees were dying, the dolphins were dying, the pelicans were dying. You could not swim in it, you could not fish in it, and that had a huge economic impact on the region.
You couldn't sell waterfront houses in Florida. I mean, there's no money for education or for any other project at that point. I mean, this is our resource.
Several years back, another former member of the Florida cabinet, Charles Bronson, this was during his time as agriculture commissioner, complained to us in a meeting that the state wasn't properly managing the land that it already owned. He said that land was becoming a haven for invasive species and other problems. So why should we be adding more land to the state's inventory if we aren't properly managing what we have?
Well, let me answer that because Charles Bronson is a good friend of mine, and I concur with him completely. I sat on the cabinet talking about those very issues. What's in this that's not well understood is the conservation easement concept, which he promoted heavily, and I strongly support. And that means that instead of straight out buying the land, in some cases you will do that, but in most cases where you can, if you have an owner that's a larger property owner, say a family that has ranch lands like we have down near Lake Okeechobee and here in Central Florida in many parts, cattle country, whatever, the way to go about doing it, and what Bronson was talking about, is don't buy the land in fee simple. Don't buy the land and have this land management team have to deal with quantities of land we can't cope with, but rather pay a smaller amount of money, and it is a smaller amount, to have what's called a conservation easement, which simply says, landowner, you get to keep that land in terms of agriculture. You manage it. It stays in private hands for land management. It stays in private hands for raising cattle or citrus or whatever it is.
Or taxation.
Or for taxation too. Absolutely, it stays in private lands for taxation, and at the same time, we are sure it isn't going to be developed with houses and with buildings and with things that it protects in that area. We don't want them to develop because we need some open land for water recharge. A lot of Floridians don't understand that our underground rivers and our water in this state are the result of rain and water that's absorbed by the soil in open land spaces. And if we don't have those, we're not going to feed those underground rivers. And the volume of water, say in Wekiva Springs, which I'm very familiar with because I'm the guy who sponsored the bill at Congress to make this a natural wild and scenic river. The volume of water coming out of there every day, the gallons per minute and all, have dramatically declined. And the reason it's declined isn't because Florida's rainfall has declined. It's because we've taken so much of the land off of the market, if you will, or put it on the market for development, meaning houses, meaning concrete, meaning things that we need in the future to make sure there's a lot of open land. And it doesn't mean that we buy all that land. It means that we provide what Bronson had envisioned, and that's conservation easement, so it just isn't developed. We're paying the landowner, by the way. He's making money on the deal. Nobody's losing anything. Nobody's forcing the sale, and there's no condemnation here. But we do say to Sam, the owner over here, this is a very high priority piece of land. You may develop it over here, you may develop it over here, but this swath right down the middle, for however wide it is, it's in the best interest of Florida never to develop that land. So we'll pay you some money and put it on the books so you can't sell it to somebody for development, or you can't develop it yourself.
And this goes right back to the issue you raised of legislative prioritization. Right now, the legislature has not chosen to give money for maintenance of these properties that we bought in many cases. This amendment specifically speaks to these funds being used for maintenance as one of the things that's on the list. So we can do a better job, and that's the purpose of this amendment.
Yeah, when you walk into the voting booth, whether you vote early or absentee or on election day, Paul, you'll read the text of the amendment and you'll see conservation, management, and restoration. So Amendment 1 provides funds not only to acquire the land, as General McCollum stated, or acquire the development rights, but it also provides funding so we can address those management needs that former Commissioner of Agriculture Bronson raised, and many others have raised. It's a very legitimate concern and a real need, and it's a need that Amendment 1 is specifically designed to address. So in addition to funds for acquisition, there are also funds for management and restoration to deal with some of those invasive exotic issues that he talked about.
And the Florida Cabinet is a check where Bronson served with me and at that time Alex Sink and then Governor Christ, and today it's Scott and Bondi and so on. That's a check on all this, because nobody's going to buy any land, nobody's going to decide to do a conservation easement, nobody can do any of that without running it through the board, of which is comprised of the cabinet. So it works really well if there are resources there for them to decide how to allocate it. And of course, their administrators are going to recommend things, but I know we want a rubber stamp. We get there and argue. You know that all too well.
Been that dance.
And I'm sure that's true today too.
Now, this would not be a problem with conservation easements, but outright land purchases would take land off the property tax rolls. Doesn't that hurt the budgets of state and local governments every time that's done?
No, not if it's done right. If it's done well, Central Park is the quintessential example. If you you don't have to go to Central Park to see it. If you look around state parks, the values of the lands around state parks are invariably higher than those distances that are more. Look around Wekiva, look around and go to North Florida and see it at Mariana, at the caverns, and the highest values in that community are right around it. You create, if you do this right, now this doesn't mean you go willy-nilly and just buy to buy, but if you do this right, you create value. That's pretty good economics.
And it's like the land purchase that we looked at for the bears to have a corridor up to Ocala National Forest here. And, we have an increasing bear population. Hopefully some of them are going that way. There are times when you want to make an outright purchase, but most of the time it can be done with a conservation easement, unless it's a park. Like you said, some places you got to buy. I mean, I don't want to degrade that point you're making. But as Allison says, that will increase values. If our state grows properly and is properly managed, we're going to have plenty of tax revenues.
And with a conservation easement, the land stays on the tax rolls. It's not taken off the tax rolls. It's continued to provide those property tax revenues. But it's much more fundamental than that. I'm not going to get the slogan exactly right, but if you look at Seminole County right here in Central Florida, I think their slogan is Seminole County Naturally. They're marketing the natural resources like the Wekiva River and Rock Springs Run and the Ocala National Forest and all of the wonderful local parks and nature preserves that actually Seminole County voters have voted to increase their taxes and dedicate funding for, which has then been matched by state funding. It's those natural areas and parks and the trails that are their local economic driver. So the increase in sales tax, people coming there to stay, eating in restaurants, all of the associated economic benefits that go along with that far outweigh any decrease in property taxes. And the fact of the matter is a lot of the lands we're talking about now are already taxed at a very low rate. They're already in the Greenbelt assessment. So they're taxed as agricultural lands essentially and not really bringing in all that much revenue at all.
Opponents of this amendment are pointing out that something like 25% of Florida land is already publicly owned. And their question is, isn't that enough? That seems like an awful lot. 1 out of every 4 acres publicly owned.
Well, first of all, a lot of that publicly owned land is land that's owned around and dealing with the Everglades, the Big Cypress areas that are large tracts of land that had to be acquired to be protecting the state interest. When I was on the Florida cabinet, we saw some land that we actually put back on the market. That's something that's not understood either. If the land isn't suitable for acquisition or conservation easements, then it ought to be put back into the public domain. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. On the other hand, if we don't do something about it and have the right mix of land that the state owns, that are conservation easements where we don't own it, but we keep it from being developed, our water bodies and our wildlife and our vegetation that make Florida Florida will disappear. It's as simple as that. And let me add this, Paul. I'm not knocking anybody in particular, but having sat in that position and seen it, the developers in our state, if you own certain land or you want to develop it, even if you don't own it, you want more land to build on. And you don't want any impediment to that. And there has to be a proper check and balance. I want to see our state grow. I mean, we're going to continue to grow. Good grief. We're going to zone land that's appropriate. But somebody has to place a check on that. And part of that job is the Florida Cabinet's job if you give them the resources like this and you give them some discretion. The legislature can't make all these decisions. They don't do that individually. But there is a body that does it. And it's just not some land czar out there that's going to just go out and buy up all this land. It's going to be a judicious discretion if there is land that's actually purchased. And believe you and me, all those interest groups are going to come speak, argue, the cities and the counties. If this isn't a good deal, if it isn't a good deal for everybody, it's not going to happen.
Yeah,
this is just providing the opportunity for it to happen, and hopefully it will in the right way.
Yeah, the science doesn't get you to that argument. The Florida's land acquisition program is very complex and very balanced between all of the different players at the table, and we don't, generally speaking, buy land that isn't scientifically needed, and when we do, there's a mechanism for disgorging it. And even if you carry that just to the sheer economics of it, Monroe County, where I came from, is 95% in federal or state hands and has the highest land values in the state. So I mean, it's just I think it's a straw man argument, frankly.
72% of Florida is in private ownership, and if the state were successful in acquiring all of the lands that have been identified on the current Florida Forever priority list, we were talking about adding another 3 to 5% in public ownership. So this is not a radical proposal.
And
by any
public
stretch.
ownership includes all of the Everglades. It includes Eglin Air Force Base, which is about 250,000 acres. It includes every university, every public school. I mean, this is a shell game argument, in my opinion.
The amendment refers to agricultural land and ranch land being among the possibilities for acquisition. Now, I understand that if conservation easement is used, they can continue to be productive agricultural properties. But if it's just paid out, if it's purchased outright, is that not diminishing a valuable industry for Florida?
No, we're not doing anything to diminish Florida's agricultural land base. First, as General McCollum already said, it's going to be hard to maintain agriculture here if you don't have clean water. And so First Amendment 1 is about protecting our state's clean water for agriculture, for wildlife, for our state's economy. Second, the reference in the amendment text to working farms and ranches is all about these conservation easements that we've been talking about letting the landowner continue to be a good steward of that land, whether it's to produce food and fiber or whether it's to maintain the habitat, wildlife habitat that's there. But that's really what we're talking about there is conservation easements to private partnership conservation agreements between private landowners and public agencies where the land stays in private ownership, the development rights are retired, and so the public knows it won't be developed, but it continues to produce.
Some farmers and ranchers don't understand this. I came from a ranch family. That's what I grew up on. There's
Me
nothing.
too.
There's nothing in here that's going to do anything but good for them. Because first of all, there's no condemnation involved in this. We're not out. People have got to voluntarily want to sell any land that the state says we'd like to acquire. And number two, they've got to go through a process at some point of deciding, do we really want to develop land or not? I mean, it's not going to take away development rights. That's really what I think a lot of them are worried about. Saying, well, I want to develop this land. Well, nobody here, this isn't what this is about. There may be zoning or something else that the local government decides. We're not deciding that, but we are proposing in certain areas that this is valuable land. We'd like to see it protected and that you don't build houses or stores or highways on it. And if you're willing to agree with us with this, we'll give you some money, pay you for the loss of the value that you would have gained by being able to build those buildings on in the future, something, maybe not dollar for dollar, but equivalent. And then most of them aren't ready to develop it anyway. Most of this is rural. So it's a win-win for the farmer if he chooses or she chooses to actually engage in these conservation easements. They keep the land. They get to keep raising cattle or oranges or whatever, and all they're giving up is the right to put houses on it someday or whatever, and they're getting paid for that.
Florida's done a lot of that, and in fact, the more sophisticated ag folks, and I come from a citrus and cattle family too. We were in the cattle and citrus business since the 1850s in Florida, and but they're now doing flowage easements. They're doing a lot of very sophisticated work in this area, which is where it should go.
And some of the states, longtime ranching and agricultural landowners and families are strong supporters of Amendment 1.
Is there a risk if this passes that the legislature will create such a broad definition for eligible expenses that at the end of the day it won't have the impact that it might have had if they had a narrower definition for what constitutes conservation and land acquisition and habitat protection, the goals of the amendment? Could it be so diluted by a legislature creating too broad a definition?
Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.
Yeah, you're right, Paul, that you could broaden the definitions and you could have bad administration. But the fact that the legislature were to do that, and I don't know they would, because this is pretty comprehensive as it is, but you still have the checks of the executive branch that's executing this, the fund itself, and then the Florida cabinet overseeing it. So before we go out and we willy-nilly spend a lot of money, there's the uniqueness there's no other state that has this system of government like we have, where in addition to the legislature, you have a divided, if you will, executive, so the governor doesn't make all these decisions by himself. So you could even have a governor someday who's not necessarily as friendly to the cause as perhaps we are, or the present governor may be, but we would still have 3 other elected statewide office holders that are going to have to, you got to get a majority. You get 3 of them in order to get anything done.
But a big fat 75% on this would really help everybody stay focused. So,
and I would, also say that nearly 1 million Florida voters signed petitions to place a water and land conservation amendment on the ballot. Florida voters strongly support water and land conservation. There have been over 100 municipal and county referenda on the ballot in Florida dedicating funding for water and land conservation. 82 of those have been approved by Florida voters. Almost every major urban county in the state has dedicated funding at the local level for water and land conservation. So, we saw recently when the state did what we believe was a misguided approach to try to fund conservation through disposal of conservation lands, not surplus lands.
Right.
The people of the state of Florida rose up in arms, and the state started with a list of about 500 acres that they thought were appropriate to sell and back into private ownership. And by the time they concluded the process, not 1 acre was put up for public sale because of the opposition, because of the love that Floridians have for their water and land.
Well, I think that that completes my questions. Is there any thing that you all would like to conclude with before we end the interview?
Well, one thing, Paul, very specific to the Sentinel, I know, I don't know if all the papers are going to endorse on amendments or if you are or not, but there are limited resources to run a budget to get an amendment like this accomplished. So the media attention to something like this is very important. The interview today is important. But I know we would all really appreciate it and hope that you would consider endorsing the amendment and putting the weight of the paper behind it so that people understand some of these nuances. So when they read what you say about it, which I hope that you would say, some of the bogeymans that you pointed out in the questions are dispensed with. And then they can see that there's not any reason to be afraid of this amendment.
And the polling suggests that the more educated people are on this issue, the better off we are. So we are grateful for any and all attention to the facts, and thank you for your time a lot.
Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you.